microphone's okay. Okay, well, why don't we get started? Thank you so much for coming this evening to our dialogue entitled Violence, the Qur'an, and the Bible. This is certainly a very relevant topic, a very important topic, and I'm very pleased that you're able to be here this evening. I'm also very pleased that we have two very eminent individuals to help us in this dialogue here this evening. To my immediate right, Dr. Douglas Jacoby. I'll give a little background on Douglas. After obtaining his undergraduate degree in history from Duke University in 1980, Douglas completed his master's in New Testament at Harvard Divinity School in 1982. He worked from 1983 to 2003 in the full-time ministry in churches in London, Birmingham, Sydney, Stockholm, Philadelphia, Indianapolis, and Washington, D.C., and has overseen various ministry teaching programs with literally hundreds of graduates since 1995. He received his doctorate in ministry, specializing in Christian education from Drew University in 1999. Since 2005, his teaching ministry has been based at the North River Church in Marietta, Georgia. He became an adjunct professor in the MA program in Bible and Theology at Lincoln Christian University in Lincoln, Illinois in 2012. Douglas has published literally dozens of books, audio sets, DVDs dealing with Christianity, Christian apologetics, and faith, and is a much sought-after speaker on these topics across North America and indeed around the world, having spoken in over 120 countries to date. His latest book is entitled Answering Skeptics. And then to Douglas's right is Dr. Shabir Ali. I'll give a little bit of background on Shabir. After obtaining his BA in Religious Studies from Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario, Shabir completed his MA and PhD in Islamic Studies at the University of Toronto, with his doctoral thesis focused on Quranic exegesis. Shabir has been an active member of the Islamic community in Toronto for over 30 years and is an internationally sought after speaker, scholar, and theologian, and is the author of numerous books on Islam and Christianity. He is the founder and resident scholar of Let the Qur'an Speak, which is a show broadcast weekly on Canadian national television that promotes the understanding and appreciation of Islam and Muslims globally. He has lectured on Arabic, the Quran, and Islamic studies in the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Toronto, and is president of the Islamic Information and Dawah Center International here in Toronto. Quite honestly, I could not think of two individuals who are better qualified to address the topic which we're considering here this evening. I will go over the schedule for this evening. To begin with, both Douglas and Shabir will have 20 minutes to present their opening positions, Douglas first, followed by Shabir. Following the openings, they will have each 5 minutes to respond to one another. Again, Douglas first, and then Shabir. At that point, each will have the opportunity to address one another with 3 questions. Shabir first, he will have 10 minutes to address 3 questions to Douglas, and then Douglas will in turn have 10 minutes to address 3 questions to Shabir. Following that, we will have an audience question and answer period of approximately 30 minutes in length. You will all have the opportunities to submit questions. I've got a couple of individuals with paper in the audience that you can use to write down your questions and then pass them up to the front, and we can address them to Douglas and Shabir. The intention in the audience Q&A is that the questions alternate. So say, for instance, the first question is directed at Douglas. He will have 2 minutes to respond, at which point Shabir will in turn have 1 minute to respond. The next question would then be directed to Shabir, who would have 2 minutes to respond, and Douglas have 1 minute in turn to respond, etc. So the individual to whom the question is directed will alternate between Douglas Shabir, etc. The intention there is just to ensure that Both of these individuals have an opportunity to share with us their knowledge, their expertise, and that we really have a well-rounded dialogue here this evening. And then finally, in closing, both Douglas and Shabir will have 5 minutes to provide their closing arguments. Shabir first, and then Douglas will close us out. So that's the way the evening is intended to go. You may have seen this evening advertised as a debate. Both Douglas and Shabir have asked me to emphasize that this is not a debate, it's a dialogue. And there is a difference. Literally in a debate, one's intention is to defeat one's opponent. And we don't want anyone to be losers here this evening. Clearly, if we can address the difficult questions that this topic brings up and address them honestly, in good faith, in an effort to really find the truth, then everybody wins. And I think it would be a shame to miss the opportunity of this gathering to really address those difficult questions. So while this is not a debate, it's also not, we're not just using this opportunity to just consider those questions on the surface. This is intended to get deep into issues involving the Quran and the Bible and violence that really need to be addressed. So that's a bit of the groundwork for tonight. So I think I've said enough. Why don't we get on with the dialogue? So at this point, we'll begin with opening positions. Douglas, you have the floor. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you so much. And thank all of you who've made time to be here in Toronto. For those who are watching online or streaming, grateful to the Toronto Islamic Information and Dawah Center for making this happen, plus special friends around the city. And it's great to see Shabir again after almost 10 years. And but the Hadith of Bukhari, acknowledged by scholars to be the most accurate collection in its many volumes, 9 volumes, is something I've spent a lot of time at. And that's very important for me because teaching students in the master's program, you know, it's easy to misrepresent a position of someone who's not there to defend himself. It's fine for me to talk about the Buddhists, but unless I'm actually very careful and there's no kind of check on that thing, I could get away by misrepresenting. That's something I would hate to do. Violence is a global issue. No one has a monopoly. Catholics, Buddhists, Jews are persecutors. Everyone's a persecutor. I was just a few months ago in Rwanda, in Kigali, where almost 1 million people were hacked to death. Tutsis killed by Hutus. This was back in '94. And I was at the Genocide Memorial, and underneath my feet is where hundreds of thousands of people have been buried. They actually brought them in lots of 100,000. Nearly 1 million people killed. What is going on? And that they're supposed to be Christian. I was a couple years ago in Myanmar, and people don't realize this that have been in Burma, and perhaps you know, but there is the Buddhists who are persecuting the Muslims. And people act surprised, like, you think human nature is different in the world? I mean, Christians get persecuted by the Hindus in India. It all goes around. And of course, as a frequent visitor to Israel, I'm well familiar with the persecution, the structural and military violence against Palestinians. And I'm sensitive to that issue as well. This is a timely dialogue, particularly in light of the recent killings in Quebec City, which we heard about all over the world. And sadly, many times every year, this kind of scenario is played out at mosques, synagogues, shrines, temples, churches. Just an incredible amount of killing. No one has a monopoly, in other words. And yet, as I will try to explain, I believe there is a strain of violence that is concerning to me, not just in every religion, but I'm talking tonight about Christianity and Islam. And some things I have to say may be unpleasant, particularly if you're a Muslim, you love Allah, you love the Quran, you love your people. Please bear with me. I'll try hard. A few years ago, I was on Qatar Airways, pretty good airlines. And I was I'd been in Doha in Qatar. I was on the way to the Republic of Georgia. And I thought, what should I listen to? So I put on the headsets. And it was someone singing the Quran. And I was so fascinated, it was so beautiful, that I just listened to it for about 30 or 40 minutes before I did something else. And I had several hours in the air before landing in Tbilisi. I can understand how people would feel inspired, people would feel very moved, even if they didn't speak Arabic, because there's a power in the sung word. But to have substantial discussion, we can't only talk about feelings. We need to focus on content. And that's the way I think we take most seriously the founders of these two great religions, Muhammad and Jesus. My approach is to stick very closely to the early period. That is Christianity from the beginning in the year 30 AD until the time of Constantine, but nearly 3 centuries later. And similarly, I have a special interest in what early Islam was like in the lifetime of not only Muhammad, but his successors, his companions, those first couple hundred years, because I think we know a lot about what was going on at that time. And I'm not trying to cop out here. Okay, he's going to stick to the early period so he can skirt the issue of the Crusades. No, that's not the point, and we'll probably end up coming there anyway. But I think the early period is more productive for understanding the essence of these two faiths. And so the current title of our interaction is the Bible and the Qur'an. The original one was Christianity. Well, it is Christianity and Islam. But I was not originally going to limit myself to the Qur'an, particularly since I'm so excited about all the stuff I've learned in the Hadith. So it will be a little bit of a mixture of the two. Why is this important? Because if you are a Christian and you read the New Testament, but you never read the 4 Gospels, you'd kind of be guessing at what was going on. What's Peter referring to in his letter? What's Paul saying? That necessary background, that biography, is found in the Gospels. And outside of that, you're doing a lot of guessing. Well, so it is in Islam. The Hadith are the records of the words and actions of the Prophet. And that, in a way, makes that analogous to the role of the Gospels, the function of the Gospels in the New Testament. And so that's why that's so important. Warfare has been a significant aspect of Islam since the beginning. Various surahs are connected with different battles. Think of the Battle of the Trenches or the Battle of Badr or others that may come to mind. In the expansion of Islam, not only in the Arabian Peninsula, but very, very soon in Persia, and then very soon the other direction in Egypt. And it's incredible. By the early 700s, the Islam is strong in Spain. It almost it's in France. It comes down to that Battle of Tours, I think in 732. History could have been very different, very expansive, something powerful, something very attractive here. But it didn't just spread by presenting a case and people weighing it and responding. Let's be real here. If an army shows up in your country or on your border and gives you an offer, yes, there's reasoning. Do we submit, or do we get placed in a different tax category and pay more as zimmis? Or perhaps there's even a military option. A decision has to be made. I'm quick to tell my Christian friends that it's just false to say that Islam is spread by the sword and Christianity is spread by love. That's just not true. But it's not true either to say that it was just all love and daffodils. Fight with them until there is no more persecution, and all religions are for Allah. Surah 8. I will cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieve, therefore strike off their heads. Also Surah 8. The only punishment of those who wage war against Allah and His Apostle and strive hard for mischief. For the land is execution, crucifixion, cutting off hands and feet from the opposite sides of the body, or exile from the land. The Quran even has forgiveness of sins for taking part in the holy war. Your sins will be blotted out. Now, 500 years later, Christians did exactly the same thing. The Pope says, join the crusade, all your sins will be blotted out. You'll have an easy time in the afterlife. Very, very compelling. And yet, the Quran gives us something of an incomplete picture. So, just a little bit from the Hadith, where So it seems to me that dying in battle seems to be almost the most virtuous thing one can do. Maybe the most righteous deed you can do, or the second, or the third, depending on which hadith. Paradise is for him who holds the reins of his horse to strive in Allah's cause with his hair unkempt and his feet covered with dust. When I read that, I can almost smell the dust and feel the heat of battle. There are attacks on the caravans, sometimes even attacks without warning. Bukhari 3:17. Spoils of war drive the expansion. I'm aware that in some cases it was redress for wrongs done to Muslims, and in a way this was a settling of score, getting things even again. But I also read in Hadith that one was entitled to seize one's enemy's possessions, and you could keep them as long as you could prove afterwards that indeed this guy would have been your enemy, which is, it's hard to imagine that he would not have been after you had just taken his everything he owned. Allah's apostle said, I've been ordered to fight the people till they say, none has the right to be worshipped but Allah. Bukhari, that's in volume 1. The Prophet said, by him who holds my life in his hand, I will bring you slaughter. Ishaq 130, the authorized biography, and also Tabari, volume 6. Killing disbelievers is a small matter to us. Surely the gates of paradise are under the shadow of swords, from Sahih Muslim. And after 622, there's more violence in the movement. And again, we want to say it expanded because of this or that. There are multiple factors, but violence is part of that. Were Christians any better? I think of Charlemagne in the 8th century. I think it was in 772, by forcibly baptized 100,000 people. Well, that's no way to grow a church. And I think Christians need to be aware of their history in that way. However, I'm concerned that some of the radicals have studied the history of early Islam, and they are using the text of the Qur'an and of the Hadith to justify their actions. Now, you may object and say, well, the real jihad is warfare against one's passions, like Al-Ghazali and others. I get that. Jihad is a struggle. It's more than that. But when I read the Hadith, I've never seen jihad, at least not in Bukhari. It's always referring to battle. And Shabir, in your book, Common Questions, people ask about Islam. The very first question you address is, what is jihad? And you give several definitions, and the holy war is number 3. But from my perspective, reading the Hadith, jihad would be, the holy war would be number 1. That seems to be the way it is used. And again, I saw that in one of your presentations in 2015 at YouTube. So what about Christianity? Pitiful. Pitiful job obeying Jesus' teaching, atrocities galore from the Middle Ages on. And yet, we may not know, but the early church was pacifist, actually unanimously pacifist. For one, they were a persecuted people. For two, they weren't allowed to serve in an army, nor were they a state. They were only a minority within a larger empire. That pacifism of the first century carries over into following centuries. So in the mid-2nd century, Justin Martyr, a former philosopher from Samaria, says, we who formerly murdered one another now refrain from making war even upon our enemies. I'm just going about 50 years later. Tertullian, a lawyer from North Africa, emphasizes that Christians are not permitted to fight, even in self-defense. I find a similar passage from Cyprian in the year 250 in North Africa. And 50 years later, Lactantius in Rome, God forbids us to kill. It will not be lawful for even a just man to engage in warfare. So there's your original Christian position, that even if you're provoked or attacked, even if it's defensive, it is forbidden to a Christian. This makes perfect sense, I think, in light of Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus says, you heard it was said, love your enemy, love your neighbor, hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Warfare became part of Christianity only in the later 4th century, when the peaceful religion of Jesus was hijacked. Closely associated with warfare is martyrdom. The mujahid is promised a place in paradise. It's not just in the Quran. I have all the references if you want in Hadith, but you can get these yourself. Martyrdom in jihad is better than the entire world. One would rather even live and die 10 times as a martyr. That than simply just go on and miss the glory of taking part in that jihad. But martyrdom in Christianity is a very different thing. As far as I'm aware, and I could be wrong, but in Christianity, martyrdom is never the killing of someone else. It's the refusal to use violence and thus being willing, like Christ, to suffer a violence oneself. And there are stories of for example, of newly converted soldiers in Christianity. Newly converted, they were already in the army, and then they're commanded to attack, and they won't do it because they're not going to kill their enemy, and so they're executed. They're martyred. In some cases, even before they could be baptized. This strain of violence that I'm looking for as we compare these two great faiths is not just in war, it's in criminal law, and the penalties, whether it's cutting off the hands or the beheading, may not have been unusual in the 7th century, but today, I think probably most of you in the room would agree that that's way out of step with the modern age, even though factions like Boko Haram or the Taliban or ISIS are enjoying trying to use that standard. It's very painful to read these stories of what is happening today and even what is happening back then. And plus, it's ineffective. Draconian punishments don't really change people. You want proof? Look at the U.S. prison system. We've got millions of our citizens in prison. It really doesn't work. It doesn't rehabilitate. A climate of fear is not what builds morality. It simply doesn't work. But two aspects of violence are especially concerning to me, and they are the blasphemy crimes and then the penalties for apostasy. Blasphemy, which could lead to amputation, beheading, flogging, fine, imprisonment. But apostasy, unless this has changed recently, all the schools of Islamic jurisprudence agree that a man must be executed if he leaves the faith. Even if he's only been Muslim for 1 hour, he must be executed. Women, maybe not. Maybe life in prison or life until they recant, until they go back. This is something I found not only in the Hadith, but you'll find this spirit throughout. This also meant if you're apostate that your marriage is annulled, your children are seized, your goods are seized, and you're given maybe a short time to reconsider. Last year, a member of my own fellowship in a Muslim land was due to be executed. I was very surprised that they hadn't already done it, but they were giving him some time to recant. And, he ended up escaping, and so not needing to recant in that respect. But to say that there's no compulsion in religion, Surah 256, that just doesn't work. There's plenty of coercion in the historical record. Christianity, no better. After the first few hundred years, no better. There's an historian, he was a pagan historian in the 4th century, Ammianus, and he talks about the Christians. And this is, again, after the Christians have taken up the sword, they've said it's okay to kill your enemy. He said, "No wild beasts are such enemies to mankind as are the majority of Christians and their deadly hatred of one another." That's not the kind of thing that makes me feel proud as a Christian. But I'm afraid he's probably right, because the persecuted became the persecutor very quickly. We could talk about domestic violence, though time forbids, and particularly Surah 4, verse 34. I should say something about the spirit of getting even, insisting on one's right, retaliation, that seems to run fairly strong in Qur'an and Hadith. There's this kind of pleasure in, we're driving behind someone who's too slow, we finally get past him, we want to show him, look how slow you are, how stupid you are. We want to get even, we want to kind of make a point. There's a lawsuit. In the New Testament, Christians are forbidden to even be in lawsuits. The early church refused to do it because that's coercion. In effect, you're calling on the authority of the sword because if he doesn't submit, he's going to be in trouble with the law. Jesus said, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. This is truly an amazing thing. Now, to be very fair, Muhammad did not always insist on this law of retribution, lex talionis. I found at least 2 places in the Hadith where he suspended it, where he decided to show mercy. But he also prayed for the punishment of his enemies. Bukhari 2, 116. Whereas Jesus said, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing, Luke 23:34. Muhammad seeks justice. Jesus seeks mercy. These are quite different emphases. Cursing. Oh, we know the prank of the camel innards placed on Muhammad's back while he was praying, and what happened to those 7 people who were thrown into the well, and sadly many other stories like that. It's inhuman to bless when someone's being cursed. That's what Nietzsche said. The world cannot understand. But Bukhari 4, when cursed, curse in return. Muhammad's final words are a curse against Jews and Christians. Paul said, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. Taking offense, being too sensitive, rioting when offended, this idea of an insult requires a reprisal, is a traditional view of honor in Christianity that's inverted. The strong give up their honor. They're willing to be subjected to abuse, even killed if necessary. And so in so many ways, I think it's not just the life and times of 7th century Arabia that's involved here. At the heart of the issue we're discussing is a kind of violence even in Muhammad himself. And perhaps I'll be able to share more about that in a minute. I need to close. Through warfare, martyrdom, criminal penalties, domestic violence, apostasy, retaliation, rioting, I think it's disingenuous to claim that violence in Islam is exceptional. I'm not sure I would say it's normative, but I would definitely say it's there. Compare the two religions. Please do. The later you go, the more similar they are. But compare the religions. One is inconsistent with the teaching of the founder. The other is not inconsistent. Romans 12, not just not hurting your enemy, but actually feeding him, going out of your way. The way of violence is evil. It is permitted, not just by Islam, but by many, many religions. But the way of violence is rejected by Jesus Christ. And I think that's a starting place for a very important discussion.
Douglas, thank you. Shabir, you have the floor. You have 20 minutes.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out here tonight. Let me begin by praising our Creator and Fashioner, the Creator of the heavens and the earth, asking to send peace and blessings upon all of His prophets, His messengers, all of the righteous people throughout time, and on all of us here tonight and our loved ones. I ask God to bless our meeting here tonight and make it fruitful, to increase our understanding of these two great religions, Islam and Christianity, and of the two great world scriptures, the Qur'an and the Bible. I want to thank Scott for graciously agreeing to be the moderator for our event tonight. And I thank Doug, my old friend, for insisting that we have this dialogue and traveling all the way from Atlanta for us to have it. I think we're off to a good start, and I hope that God will open up our minds and hearts to understand His messages for humankind, and to help us to understand the truth, whether that is found in Christianity or in Islam, in the Bible or the Quran, or perhaps in both. Now, as for our topic, the topic is carefully worded: violence, the Quran, and the Bible. And in fact, this wording came out of an email that Doug sent me as we first started to think about what topic we might decide on. Doug sent me a list of several propositions, of which I copied and pasted specifically this one. I pasted this back to him and said, okay, let's agree on this one: violence, the Quran, and the Bible. So I was a little bit surprised to find that Doug was a little bit uncertain whether the topic is the Quran and the Bible or Islam and Christianity. It seemed that he wanted to go into Islam and Christianity, and he was somehow conscious that he was going off topic there, but nevertheless he couldn't resist being drawn into that tangent. Secondly, Doug focused a lot on hadith, and he tried to justify that by saying, while the topic is about the Quran, I cannot avoid using the hadith, because to do that, to avoid using the hadith, it would be like quoting one of the letters in the New Testament without referring to the Gospels. Of course, that makes it necessary now for me to explain something about the relationship between the Quran and the hadith. For Muslims, the Quran is the central document. This, to Muslims, is the Word of God. Now, over Islamic history, Muslim scholars have tended to say that the hadith which are collections of sayings attributed to our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, collected outside of the Quran, they have said that the hadith is essential for understanding the Quran. And this is where Doug gets some traction by saying, look, this is what you guys say. You hold the hadith to be necessary for explaining the Quran. However, it is essential in a discussion like this one for us to know precisely what does the Quran say as distinct from what anyone else says, including what is said in the hadith. For Muslims, undisputedly, the Quran is the word of God. But hadith, by its very nature, is believed by Muslims to have been transmitted initially by word of mouth from one person to another for many generations until they were finally put into the written books that we have today. And although Muslims generally consider Sahih al-Bukhari to be the most authentic of the collected works of this nature, nonetheless, it is not required of every Muslim to believe in every one of the hadith that is recorded in Bukhari. We have great scholars in Muslim history who have actually denied some of the statements which are now found in Sahih al-Bukhari. We have companions of the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, Aisha, the mother of the believers, who has contested, she and others have contested some of the statements which later on came to be collected in the standard collections, including that of Sahih al-Bukhari. So what does Sahih mean in this context? The Arabic word Sahih literally means correct or authentic, but within the field of hadith studies, this is a designation given to a narrative which has a chain of narrators leading all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, narrators whom we have come to generally trust. So what we're saying is that even though this narrative was related from one person to another person to another person by word of mouth, we know all of these persons and we trust them. But does that mean that none of these persons could have made a mistake? No, it doesn't mean that. They're human beings like the rest of us. The best of them could have also made mistakes. So what do we do with a narrative that goes contrary to the Quran itself? Now, scholars have had two options here, and they have picked the option which I would not choose. They have picked the option of trying to reconcile that saying with the Quran somehow, by modifying the meaning of the Quran in some way, by modifying the statement of the hadith in some way to try to bring them closer together. So you have two things at odds with each other. You try to bring them closer together. That's not my option. I wouldn't pick that option because to me, once you do this, if the Quran is here and you do this, you are moving away from the Quran itself. So the option I would choose is that of Aisha, the mother of the believers, who in a case like this would say, Hasbukum kitab Allah. The book of God is enough for you. So when the book of God, the Quran, says something and the hadith indicates something else, I and many students of Islam today would say, we go with the book of God, the Quran, and in that case, that singular narrative cannot be taken into consideration, though we may rely on other hadiths dealing with other aspects of the faith that are not contrary to the Quran, and for that matter, that are not contrary to reason. So with this in mind, our topic then is very clear. Violence, the Quran, and the Bible. Now we need to address the question of violence with reference to these two great sacred scriptures. Now, it seems that for a great bit of Doug's presentation, it was just simply assumed that the Bible is free of violence, and we're only talking about the teachings of Jesus, who stood for peace. But let's be fair and examine both books. First, let's examine the Quran, and then let's examine the Bible as well. Now, in examining these books, it is important for us to be fair. And to be fair, we need to start with some criteria and think about how might we decide if a book is a book of peace or is it really about violence? So I would propose three criteria. I would say, first, let's think about whether the book actually calls on us to live peacefully, the entire book as a whole in its main thrust and its underlying message. And second, how does this book present its heroes and great figures and models? Does the book present persons and heroes who are shown for being violent persons, or, on the other hand, peaceful persons? And third, given that both books do actually deal with actual situations of war, in situations where war was unavoidable, do these books speak of war and give prescriptions regarding war within what we would refer to as just war theory today, or is it impossible to reconcile these teachings with just war theory? So those are my three criteria. Now for the first, how does that apply to the Quran? Does the Quran call on us to live peacefully? Indeed it does. In the Quran, in the second chapter, the 208th verse, the Quran says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O you who believe, udkhulu fis silmi kaffa, enter into peace, all of you together, or enter into peace completely. It can be translated two ways. Now, we have seen that Doug has referred to hadith and sometimes to classical Islamic law and so on. Often, this passage has been reinterpreted by Muslim scholars to mean enter into Islam completely. But the verse itself does not say enter into Islam. It doesn't say, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu udkhulu fil islami kaffa. It doesn't say enter into Islam, all of you together. It says enter into silm. The word is silm there, not Islam. And silm simply means musalaha, or entering into peaceful agreement. So the verse of the Quran is very clear, despite what commentators have made of it over time and what even hadith may have said about that. So it's very clear that the Quran actually calls on Muslims to live peacefully. What about the second criterion? How does the Quran present its heroes and models? We would notice in the Quran that while the Quran actually is very similar to the Bible and repeats many of the biblical stories, even in a summary form, the Quran is distinguished from the Bible in two ways for our present topic. One is that the Quran omits mention of some of the most violent characters in the Bible. Let's take, for example, Samson. Samson in the Bible seems to go after violence just for the sake of violence. Sometimes he just becomes angry with the Palestine or Philistine people, as they were called at the time, and he would go kill them wantonly. He's shown for his violence in the Bible, but he's not mentioned in the Quran at all. Sometimes a figure is mentioned in the Bible, and his violence is glorified. Whereas in the Quran, his violence is either minimized or not mentioned at all. Now, Abraham in the Bible took up arms to go and rescue his nephew Lot. Now, it's not a bad thing, but that is mentioned in the Bible. But this act of violence, though it was not a bad thing, is not even mentioned in the Quran. Abraham is presented as one of our role models. In fact, the role model, in that the Quran insists on Muslims to say, Bal millata Ibrahima Hanifa. It is the religion of Abraham, the upright one that we follow. And the Quran does not mention any violence in regards to Abraham. Jesus is, well, according to Doug, very peaceful, but we do know from modern studies that in fact there is violence associated with Jesus. For example, when he went into the temple and with a whip of cords, he drove out the people who were selling doves, and he overturned the tables of the money changers. But none of this violence is mentioned with regards to Jesus in the Quran. In fact, in the Quran, it is reported, God tells us that Jesus said, وَالسَّلَامُ عَلَيَّ يَوْمَ وُلِدْتُ وَيَوْمَ أُمُتُ وَيَوْمَ أُبْعَثُ حَيًّا. Peace be upon me the day I was born, the day I shall die, and the day I will be raised back to life. So from this Quranic depiction of Jesus, Jesus is characterized by peace in his life, his death, and his being resurrected one more time. So the figures of the Quran are presented as peaceful figures. Their violence is either minimized or not mentioned at all, and the most violent figures are not even mentioned at all. So that's my second criterion. What about the third, about just war theory? Now, I would argue that all of the criteria of just war theory are satisfied with the Quranic narratives. Doug cited some passages from the Quran, but that's an isolation. That's like saying, in a certain context, let's say the Canadian government sent its peacekeeping forces to defend people whether it be in Mali or in some other part of the world, they're being attacked, and their commander commands them to defend themselves by even killing the enemy. So now you take the part that says kill the enemy out of the whole context, and you say it looks like Canada is about killing people. And the answer to that is no. Canada is not about killing people. Canada is about peacekeeping and about defending those who are being attacked and the oppressed in different parts of the world. So in a similar way, taking some passages out of the Quran and just highlighting that out of the context of its history and even out of the context of the page in which it is written would give the wrong impression. So what is just war theory? Christian scholars have had to come up with this to think about how do we deal with the passages in the New Testament which acknowledge the validity of soldiering. There were soldiers who became Christians, and they were not told in the New Testament that they had to stop being soldiers. Now, there has to be a just war theory. What if Christians had the reins of government? They did not in the early centuries, and Doug was right. They had to be pacifists because to do anything else would have been suicidal. They were under Roman occupation, and they were persecuted for being Christians. Christians were being hauled into the Roman courts and forced to acknowledge the Roman gods. And if they did not, then they would be classified as atheists, God deniers, and their eyes might be gouged out, their limbs might be severed, or they might be fed to the lions, or all of these altogether. So they had to be pacifists. But what does the religion on the whole teach? Or more specifically to our topic, what does the New Testament actually show to be the case? So Christian scholars worked out just war theory. And in just war theory, we have certain components. First of all, what are the reasons for going into war? What is the justification for going into war? Jus ad bellum, to use the Latin terminology. Usually 5 criteria are mentioned. One is that there has to be a just cause. Second, it has to be with the right intention. In other words, even though you have a just cause, you cannot go tangentially. You cannot say, okay, there are some people oppressing some others in the Middle East, but let's go there and we'll get some oil, because that's wrong intention. It should be only for the pure intention of defending those who are being oppressed. So just cause with the right intention, called by a legitimate authority, and when there is a reasonable hope for success. And there's one other criterion that slips my mind at the moment, but it will come back eventually. But you see that there are criterion for entering into war. The last one was that this should be the last resort. You have tried everything else, and everything else is failing. Negotiations are failing. Diplomatic efforts fail. Now you have to go to war. So these are the criteria. Now, what about criterion within the war? Even though you've entered the war with good cause and called by a legitimate authority and all of that, how do you proceed in war? 2 principles are generally mentioned. One is non-combatant immunity. You cannot attack civilians and people who are not fighting against you. And second is that the force must be used proportionally to the harm that is there already inflicted and that you are trying to correct. So proportionality. When we look at all of these 7 criteria, we'll see that every passage of the Quran fits somewhere along of any one of these criteria, and shows that overall the picture is that the Quran is calling us towards peaceful living, but at the same time giving prescriptions such that if you have to go to war for a legitimate cause, called by a legitimate authority with right intention, and when this is the last resort, and so on, that you must enter into the war with these principles in mind, that non-combatants must be safe from your harm, and the force that you use must only be proportional for the cause at hand, so that you can bring everything back to peace, which is the original situation. If we have more time, we would go through the verses one after another and see that all of the verses fit within this broader context. So, in short then, looking at my 3 criteria, does the book actually call for peaceful living? The answer from the Quran is yes. Second, does the book present its heroes and great figures as peaceful individuals? The answer to that is yes. And third, does the book fit within just war criteria? And the answer to that is yes as well. Now, we only have a couple of minutes to now address the New Testament and in this portion of our discussion, and that will open up the floor for Doug to respond. Does the New Testament call on us, and the Bible as a whole, call on us for peaceful living? Well, this is ambiguous. It is certain that the New Testament calls us to live peacefully, but the Old Testament, it is not so clear that it does. In fact, the Old Testament has passages in which God specifically commands his people to go out and slaughter the 7 Canaanite nations. And many passages indicate that this is what they have been doing again and again. And God blames them when they do not fulfill the command and slaughter the Canaanites entirely. Now, the New Testament does call for peaceful living, but at the same time, the New Testament celebrates the fact that the 7 Canaanite nations were slaughtered by God's people. So we have some ambiguity here. But I would like to give that away and say, okay, the New Testament calls for peaceful living. The Old Testament does not seem to do so. So on this first criterion, the Bible is ambiguous. On the second criterion, how does the Bible present its great figures and heroes? When one reads the Bible, one reads about Joshua and other figures who actually carried out the wholesale slaughter. And what is interesting is that this is not only in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, those same figures are praised as the heroes of old, who were so great that the earth was not worthy to carry them, for them to walk upon the earth. We find this especially in the book of Hebrews in chapter 11, verse 33 and onwards. So on this criterion as well, it looks like the Bible does not quite add up. But of course, I'm willing to hear what Doug has to say about this. I'm sure that he has a good explanation for this, and I'm willing to learn. As for the third criterion about just war theory, no just war theory will allow for you to just simply march into a land, kill off 7 nations, take away their property, and claim it as your own. This does not fulfill the just cause. It is not proportional, and so on and so forth. It's not with the right intention and all of that. So in short, I submit that the Qur'an actually is a book of peace, and I'd like to hear from Doug how he would defend the Bible on these criteria. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shabir. Well, you raised a lot of very interesting points and very important points, which I would like to address if I can in my 5 minutes. I don't believe the Hadith is a tangent. It's how we understand the life and words of Muhammad. There are different ways. I mean, there are even artifacts. Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, you can see his swords. You have artifacts. You have his earliest biography. It's a copy of the biography, but that copy of the copy has survived. And then you've got the Quran, and then you've got the Hadith. They all need to go together. So I appreciate that Shabir was very forthcoming in saying that if there seems to be a conflict between Hadith and Quran, he always goes with Quran. I think there are an awful lot of Muslims in the world, maybe even the majority of scholars, who look at it very differently. They're not so quick to jettison the unwanted verses. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of Hadith. Almost all of them, like 95%, have been rejected by most Muslims. We're just talking about the 5% or whatever the percentage is that has survived. And they're considered to be historically reliable. There are events. See, my position doesn't actually require us to believe the Bible is true. It's just to listen to the things that Jesus was recorded as saying. If he didn't say those things, then we know even less. But my personal view, does not require that the scripture be inerrant or infallible. We have sometimes multiple attestation. In the Bible, if you have an event that's recorded, say, in all 4 Gospels, that's more weighty than one that simply appears in one, particularly if the sources are independent. One of the incidents in the life of the prophet that's very well known, he had healed some men. In their ingratitude, they killed Muhammad's chief shepherd. What does he do? Because they apostatize, he has them rounded up, cut off their hands and feet, take out their tongues, put out their eyes with irons, and refuses to give them any water, just lets them die. Now that's in Bukhari 1, verse 234, 2, 577, and 4, 261. I found that in at least 3 places. And I've not even read the hadith of Islam, and I will. When something is mentioned multiple times, we have to pay attention to that, just as historians. I mean, do people just make up these things about Muhammad? I don't think so. I don't think so at all. We mentioned so many things. Just war theory. Just war theory was invented by Ambrose and Augustine in the 4th century to justify the politicization, the militarization of Christianity, which had wandered so far. There are many passages, not just in the New Testament, but in those early centuries we can read, and we can know that these guys were pacifists. There's a failure to distinguish between the Testaments. I can't just go to the Old Testament, where God is trying to bring the people up to let the punishment fit the crime, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and then the New Testament, where Jesus says, yeah, you were told that because we brought you from barbarism to here. Now, you can't do any of it. In fact, you have to love your enemy. You have to make a distinction between those 2 testaments, otherwise we get all confused. The Old Testament says that when the Messiah comes, the sword will be beaten into plowshare. Isaiah 2:4, Micah 4:2. So in the Messianic age, there's no fighting, there's no killing. And Jesus was not a violent man. The Bible does not say that he whipped people. You read John 2, or you can read the parallel passages, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These were animals. He did not hit the people. Read the Bible and you'll see. In fact, I'm encouraging everyone here, read the Bible, read the Qur'an, read the Hadith. Then I think you'll have the information to hand that you need. Samson glorified for his violence? Samson is depicted as a juvenile with low impulse control. Israel is out of control completely. Everyone's doing what's right in his own eyes. Look at the last verse of the book of Judges. It's recorded, but it's not praised just because it's in there. Joshua was praised in the New Testament for his faith, not for his killing. David is commended for his faith despite, and for being a man after God's own heart. Even though David really messed up, in fact, because he had killed so many people, God said, you cannot build the temple because you're a man of blood. Only a person of peace, not someone who shed blood. Muhammad killed a lot of people. Okay, this is a matter of historical record. Did the early Christians, in fact, not take up the sword because the alternative was suicide? No. They took up, missed the marker. They took up the sword simply because that's what Jesus taught. They were more than willing to die. They would have been happy to be put to death for obeying their Lord. We're in part 3 now, right? So we'll go.
Okay. Thank you, Doug, for that engaging response. Now, Doug insists that if we have a hadith mentioned in 3 places in Bukhari, then this must mean more than if it's just mentioned in 1 place. But I think he doesn't understand how hadiths in Bukhari are collected. A hadith may start out with one person saying, I heard the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, saying something, and then he tells 2 people, and then the 2 people each tell 2 other people. Now it quickly multiplies into 8 different strands. And the wording may be different from one strand to another. So what a scholar like Bukhari does in the final analysis, when he cannot decide between the various strands, he brings them all together, but he doesn't put them all in one place. He puts them in several places throughout his book. So now you may be reading it in one chapter and then reading it the similar thing in another chapter, and you think that these are 2 separate hadiths, but they may all actually go back to one individual, and sometimes it's one individual who told one individual who told one individual, and then it starts to branch out. So one of these individuals could have made a mistake anyway along the way, even though the resulting wording is in 3 different strands. It does not mean that this hadith is more authentic than if it was just simply narrated by one strand all the way down. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And if we have the hadith being told by one person to another person initially, it's not a multiply attested hadith as we might expect. So hadith by their very nature could be mistaken, whereas for Muslims the Quran is absolutely the word of God. And if the Quran indicates one thing, the hadith indicates another thing, these 2 are at great odds with each other. It's the hadith that goes and the Quran that stays. when it's already established from my initial presentation that the Quran actually is a book about peace, then if a hadith is indicating the contrary, it is the Quran that stays and it's the hadith that goes. We cannot modify the Quran to fit the hadith. Rather, we evaluate the hadith based on the Quran. If it's contradictory to the Quran, that cannot be part of what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had taught us. Now, Doug says, well, Jesus as the Messiah did not drive out the people. He drove out the animals with the whip of cords. But if you read the text, he actually drove out the people. Of course, their animals would have had to follow them, but it's the people that he specifically are said to have driven out. Oh, okay. He didn't hit the people, he hit the animals. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay, so Doug is acknowledging that he misspoke, and it is only he drove out the people with the cords, but he didn't hit them. He only hit the animals. I would even challenge that, because I'm not aware that the New Testament actually says that Jesus hit the animals, or that he even hit the people. But of course, the fact that he came with the whip of cords, and that became the driving force to lead the people out, I think this to be an act of violence, and it's widely acknowledged that this is an act of violence. As for the Messiah being entirely peaceful, the Dead Sea Scrolls indicate that three types of Messiah were expected. This is specifically mentioned in the New Jerome Biblical Commentary on page 1323. One Messiah would have been the King Messiah, son of David, to rule on the throne of David. Another one would have been a priestly Messiah, and another would have been a prophet. Now, the New Testament writers present Jesus as being all three, and thus by implication that he was the King Messiah, the son of David, to rule on David's throne. For him to have been that, he would have had to wrest power from the Roman government. And because they wouldn't give it up by negotiations, violence was the only way for him to wrest that power. But of course, he and his followers were weak, the New Testament shows, and it would have been suicidal again for them to wrestle with the Roman government violently. And naturally, Jesus is reported to have said to his disciples, "Put your sword away, for whoever lives by the sword will die by the sword." It would have been suicidal at that point and in that context. But in other contexts, it is clear that this Messiah, Jesus, will come back powerful and victorious with a sword coming out of his mouth, and he will slay his enemies. Revelation chapter 11, verses number 14 onward. So in the end, it turns out that this Messiah is violent. And what about Samson? He is praised in the New Testament, even though, as Doug is saying, that was a time when people did whatever was right in their own eyes. But Hebrews chapter 11 praises him as one of the heroes of old. And so too, David is said to be a man after God's own heart who did everything that God commanded him to do. Thank you very much.
So we've come to the portion where Douglas and Shabir can address one another with questions. Shabir is first with 3 questions for Douglas. So I guess given that we have the one mic, they will both stand on either side of the mic.
So, for my first question, Doug, I want to introduce you to a book entitled Peace, Violence, and the New Testament by Michael Desjardins. And he writes several chapters, and he says that his second chapter is to present the passages of the Bible which are of a peaceful nature, mainly the New Testament. And then his third chapter is to deal with the other side of that issue, to show the passages of the New Testament which actually indicate violence. And he says that we cannot avoid one or the other. We have to put them both into a singular whole. And in the end, his conclusion is that, we cannot ignore the violence because this is a dark side to the New Testament, to use his own words. What is your response to that?
In the New Testament, we find not only Jesus, but Peter and Paul insisting that we not take things into our own hand, that we not retaliate, that we not curse, that we not coerce. This is at the heart of it. It's that We have that temptation to live one way. Jesus calls us to a much higher level. So I think we have a peaceful New Testament the whole way. I don't see any passage that goes against that. And as far as the whip, yeah, he's telegraphing a message to the corrupt high priest and his father-in-law, stop this, by kicking over one of the tables. But this is a token. He's simply sending a message. There's no violence. The animals probably weren't very happy, and the people were very unhappy. But it never says that he hurt people, used violence on people.
Okay. For my second question, in Numbers chapter 31, it is mentioned that when Moses marched with the Israelites and they were seduced, the Israelite men were seduced by the Moabite women, in the end, Moses commanded them to kill the Moabites, and they, in the end, seized the spoil of the Moabites, including 32,000 virgins for the Israelite soldiers. And then Moses said, well, this was done by the commandment of God. So how do you respond to a passage like that? Do you see that really as the commandment of God to kill all these Moabite men and seize these girls, and in the meantime, their fathers, their mothers, their brothers, their older sisters would have been killed in this battle? How do you regard that?
Well, first off, not flippantly. When you come across passages like that in the Old Testament or in the Qur'an, that's rough. Our natural tendency to distance ourselves and say it doesn't really mean what it says, but I'm afraid it does. I don't know what part of the action was commanded by God. I assume it's just the fighting. But we'll find worse things than that in the Old Testament, but none in the New. There's a huge difference between the two. Because you said that, of course, Moabites are not Canaanites. The Ammonites, Moabites, and Edomites were outside. But Abraham didn't take up the sword against the Canaanites, Genesis 15, verse 16, because their sin had not reached its full measure. It's centuries later. The Jews didn't annihilate the Canaanites. They drove them out, they fought them, and probably for the most part, they intermarried with them. The inflated language, the hyperbolic language of war reporting was common in the ancient world, including in the Bible. I'm not saying no people were killed. The Canaanites were in Israel's land. It belonged to Israel, not to them. And the Canaanites were criminals. The things they were doing, from the bestiality to the incineration of their firstborn children, are things that would have brought any SWAT team anywhere in Toronto. If someone tries to live that way, they're going to be in breach of the law. The Canaanites were not just peaceful people, great people. They were living sordid lives, practicing all kinds of perversions, murdering, even killing their own firstborn children. God said, it's time now, take them out. Israel really didn't do it. And if you read Joshua and Judges carefully, they kind of did it, but they were driven out, they intermarried with them. It was a total mess. Not a neat answer, but a messy answer.
Okay. Now, the First Chronicles, First Samuel rather, chapter 15, shows God commanding Saul to go and kill the Amalekites,
Right.
Including the women and children, and he even says infants, and to spare none of them, kill everyone that breathes. And Saul is involved with this. He being a prophet of Samuel, being a prophet of God, is to take this command to Saul, and then in the end, God expresses his disapproval because Saul did not kill them all. How do you regard this? Is this really from God, or is your answer going to be similar to the one before?
It won't be as messy as the one before. It'll be a bit shorter. I believe God commanded that, and somehow it would have been better if Saul had obeyed the command than if he had not obeyed it. I admit I take that on faith. But it's the kind of story that makes me trust the Old Testament. When you have these embarrassing passages that could have been taken out easily, we could have made Saul look not only tall and handsome, but obedient and a great leader. But the warts and all, the good, the bad, and the ugly, stick to all the major characters, male and female, of the Bible, both Testaments. There's only one figure to whom this dirt does not stick, and that's Jesus. I mean, 1 Kings 8:46, no one is sinless except John 8:46. Jesus said, which of you can prove me guilty of sin? So God commanded it, probably to do it all at once rather than to do it over a process of 6 or 7 centuries, made a lot of sense. But this is a very limited time, a very short period in Israel's history where God authorized them to use that kind of force. And it wasn't because the Jews were better. Deuteronomy 9, verses 4 to 6 says the Jews in some ways were actually worse. For the peoples outside Israel, though, there was a protocol, there was a plan, found in Deuteronomy chapter 20, making an offer of peace first. But in a way, as a Christian, I look at the Old Testament, but I'm trying to follow Jesus, and Jesus said what was permitted back then, even what was commanded, it's all changed now. Now, I want you not even to retaliate. Matthew 5.
Those are my questions.
Okay. Just grab my water. Like those camels, I usually drink about 1 liter an hour when I'm speaking. Okay. Question 1, does Islam really mean peace?
Well, the word Islam obviously is an Arabic word, and it literally means submission. But it is related to the word for peace, which is salam. That both Islam and salam come from the same original Arabic root word, which consists of 3 letters, the S, L, and M. So the S, L, and M, if you put in the right vowels, you get salam. You put in vowels in a different way, you get Islam. They are related in meaning. I would say that Islam is submission to God, and through submission to God, we achieve peace. Peace with ourselves, peace with our society, peace with the animals, the environment, peace with the world.
Right, and of course you'd find a similar position in the New Testament like Romans 5. There's peace with God, which leads to peace in the world. But I haven't studied Arabic. I was interested in the way that 2 versions of that same root were used in the letter to Heraclius, the Byzantine emperor. Did I get it wrong? Aslim taslam? Submit, surrender, you'll be saved, safe. Maybe that's peace. I guess it's peace. Now, Muhammad wasn't really in a position to defeat the Byzantine Empire at that moment. But what I have studied is Hebrew. I did a couple years when I was at Harvard. And you know, these are kindred languages. I look up the triliteral root, all right? I look up Shin, Lamed, Mem, and what do I see? Well, of course, you have shalom, is peace, wholeness, but from that same root comes the word bribe, and also wall builder. For me to imply, therefore, that a good Hebrew builds walls, or that bribery is okay, this is not the way we do etymology. The fact that salam and Islam are related etymologically is not a theological argument. And I'm afraid that misleads people. I've heard you say that on YouTube. I heard a lot of people say that, but I think we could do that with other languages as well. Anyway, my second question. When I read the Qur'an the first time, and again, I'm going to encourage everyone in the room, read the Qur'an, read the Hadith, read the Bible, please. The emphasis on hell seemed to be really strong. There's almost no hell in the Old Testament at all. There are only a few passages of the New Testament. It felt like I was reading Dante. Maybe not the second time through and the third time, but it was amazing. I mean, Jesus mentions hell a couple times, Matthew, Mark, Paul in 2 Thessalonians 1. You've got the figurative language in Revelation, like Revelation 14 or 20. But they are very different. To me, the Quran has a very different feel. I know you're a scholar. You've read the whole New Testament. Would you agree that the emphasis on hell is very strong in the Quran, particularly compared to the New Testament?
Before I answer the question on a point of order, our regulations are very strict. In this portion, Doug is to ask a question, I answer, and then he asks the next question. Not that he responds to the answer that I've already given to the question. You notice that when I answered his questions, I did not respond to what he was saying. When I asked him questions and he responded, I didn't respond to his response, okay? So, as for the mention of hell in the Quran, yes, the passages are very strong in the Quran about hell, but also very strong about descriptions of paradise as well. Both paradise is described in very lurid, graphic terms, and the hell is described also in very horrific language. But it is interesting that from the Quran, one can possibly arrive at the understanding that hell is not eternal, and this is in contrast, I believe, with the New Testament, where it seems that the punishment of the people will go up to God forever, according to the book of Revelation. A great scholar of the Muslim faith, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah from the Middle Ages, has argued at length that hell will not be forever because it is clear from the Qur'an that God's mercy is overriding. We know that every chapter of the Qur'an except one begins Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful One. And it is God's mercy which necessitates paradise, which gives that share of mercy to God's servants. But God is only wrathful in response to something. That's not in his nature. And that wrath is again proportional. It has a certain function. And once that function is achieved, then the wrath subsides and there is no more. The mercy is what remains. So in the final analysis, what will remain is the paradise and not the hell. So though both paradise and hell are described in very graphic terms in the Quran, and a lot of emphasis on these two places and our ultimate abode, it is possible for Muslims to think that hell is not eternal, though paradise definitely is. And so the mercy of God shines forth in the end.
I'd like to shake your hand because this is what I've been teaching for the last 25 years. I'm not trying to subvert the order. Some things I want to respond to what you have to say, but we're together on that. There'll only be ultimately one kingdom of God, not two. Not a kingdom of Satan and a kingdom of God. You told me after our debate, actually I think it was on the stage, like after it was over, that God always protects his prophets. Jesus' death would have been, I don't know, somehow discrediting the suffering of extreme violence that would have invalidated his message. Well, many people die for their faith. Many people died for their faith even in the history of Islam. Presumably you would think that God was with them. The jihadis or maybe Hussein. I want to know, do you still hold to that position you had in 2008 that degree of suffering or humiliation would discredit Jesus? Or have you changed and do you now believe that, the cross is one of those inversions and that's actually the strength of it?
Yeah, I don't believe that I had that position in 2008. If I mentioned that to you, I may have mentioned that to you in the context that this is a position held by some Muslims who would argue for the substitutionary theory, that somebody else was made to look like Jesus and put on the cross instead of Jesus. They would hold that we cannot conceive of God allowing one of his prophets to suffer such a humiliating and scandalous death.
But you can see that. You can envision that.
I do not see that this is impossible. For God to allow this, it seems unusual, but God allows a lot of unusual things to happen in the world for good purposes. And perhaps one of the good purposes, if God allowed Jesus to hang on the cross, would be for people to see to what extent a human being can go, as Jesus would have gone in this case, in order to live a life that is faithful to God despite the opposition. So Jesus in this case would have died as a martyr, going into Jerusalem, knowing that the kinds of things that he preached would open himself to the attack of his enemies and would perhaps result in him being executed as a common criminal, as a rebel, and as an insurrectionist at the hands of the Romans. But that does not mean, of course, that I go on to say that it is legitimate for Christians to believe, based on this, that Jesus actually resurrected from the dead. Because I will add that based on my observation of the New Testament details, it is possible that Jesus did not actually die on the cross, even if he was actually hung on the cross. Usually the cross takes several hours to kill a person, and sometimes days, and Jesus hung on the cross only for a few hours. Second, when his death was reported to Pilate, it is mentioned that Pilate marveled that Jesus could have died so soon. But then he was assured by the centurion, who it turns out was already a Christian by this time, because he thought that Jesus died innocently. And he said to have proclaimed, "This is the Son of God." So the centurion could hardly be relied on to assure the Roman governor that Jesus had already been dead. If the centurion could look the other way while Jesus is being taken away from the cross alive, then it would be in the best interest of the centurion, now a Christian, to allow for that. And there is much more we can add to this, but I don't want to lengthen the answer. So I would hold to a position that it is possible, given the Quranic wording, that Jesus was hung on the cross, but he was only made to appear as if they had killed him. But the Quran says, "Ma qataluhu wa ma salabuhu." They killed him not, nor did they crucify him. And in the end, the Quran ends that verse by saying, "Wa ma qataluhu yaqina." They did not kill him for certain. Bal rafahu Allahu ilay. But God raised him to himself. Wa kana Allahu azizan hakima. And God is certainly mighty wise.
I assume.
We'll now have the question and answer portion so that you and the audience can pose questions to Douglas and Shabir. I've put a couple of people in the audience who have pads of paper that you can use to write questions on. Should we maybe take a 5-minute break to accumulate some questions, or can people pose it from
we
the...
just have one or two, we can.
So we're thinking individuals to stand and ask the question while we're collecting additional questions, or what would you think would be? So are there any questions that someone in the audience would like to pose? Please indicate who you're directing the question to. That individual will have 2 minutes to respond, and then say if that's Shabir, then Douglas will also have 1 minute to respond after Shabir's response. Is there anyone who has a question that they would like to? Yes, Kim.
So the question is, Jesus said that we should turn the other cheek. What makes me think that that is a political strategy, or that should be used by nations? I don't think that. I don't think Christianity was ever intended to be political. The kingdom of God is a minority within various nations. This is in contradistinction to the Old Testament, where the people of God are a nation. And so there's no church-state separation. For New Testament, there is church-state separation. And when they tried to put it together in the 4th century, it was a total disaster, and Christians have been causing disaster ever since. It's not a political program. A nation will need to defend itself and have borders. I get that. But if all the people who are following Christ stop killing their enemies, I doubt that would have a negative impact on the nation, since only a few people are going to be actual Christians. In the Hadith, less than 0.1% of people even go to paradise. I know we don't accept that, but it's a narrow road. And I think both faiths would acknowledge the very narrow road. So I would never expect the Christians in World War II, if they didn't fight Hitler, then we'd all be speaking German. I doubt it. I think they probably have prayed, and maybe there would have been a different outcome of the war.
I think this is a very important question, and Doug's answer shows a deep rift between the Old Testament and the New. Because if the Old Testament did prescribe a program from God where Moses is both judge and ruler, and in addition to being prophet from God, and he institutes commandments and regulations, blasphemy laws and apostasy laws and death penalties for several different crimes, and then suddenly the New Testament does away with all of that, it shows that God has actually shifted his program and changed his mind. This is problematic theologically. What is more, to the point, is that the New Testament was given and written by people at a time when Christians were being persecuted. They did not have political power. It's not that they should not have political power, but they did not at the time. And so the prescriptions they were given were communal prescription. You turn your cheek to the person within your community. But at the political level, you cannot imagine that Christians are ruling Canada and the United States claims one of our provinces, and the Christians say, well, you took Alberta, okay, take BC as well while you're at it. It cannot be. So
You think it'd be mismanaged?
my time.
Does anyone have a question here?
Or we must have some written questions.
Every individual has what this earth?
Okay. So the question is, do Muslims have a freedom of choice according to the Quran, in contrast with, or in reference also to the Bible, which gives us this freedom of choice for Christians to choose to either be Christians or Muslims? So my answer to that very quickly is that the Quran actually gives us a freedom of choice. Several passages of the Quran say, for example, "Man sha'a falyu'min wa man sha'a falyakfur." Whoever wants, let him believe. Whoever wants, let him not believe. So the freedom is definitely guaranteed in the Quran in several passages. A passage was quoted by Doug in his presentation, La Ikraha Fid Din, the second chapter, the 256th verse. This is absolute and it is unconditional. There is no compulsion in religion. It's very clear language. The Muslim law evolves differently, and some of the hadiths showed that people do not have a choice and they can be killed for leaving the faith. But that's the Quran on the one hand and Muslim law and hadith on the other hand. So I would encourage Muslims to take the Quran on this issue and insist that people do have the freedom of choice. But that does not mean that the Bible actually does give the kind of freedom of choice that Doug spoke about. In fact, in the Deuteronomy chapter 13, it's clear that if somebody calls you to worship another god, then you should bring witnesses against him. And once the matter is verified, then in fact, not only this person, but you can burn an entire city in the open square and light them as a fire to please your Lord. Deuteronomy 20, continuing from this. So the idea that the apostate should be killed is not Quranic, but it is actually biblical. The word apostasy is specifically mentioned in Deuteronomy 13 with regards to the person who calls you to worship another god. And several other passages of the Old Testament show that people might be penalized for very minor crimes in our view today.
Wow. Yeah, I find 18 different death penalties in the Old Testament. And one is for apostasy, Deuteronomy 13, as you said. Interestingly, the way the early church understood Jesus is that the death penalty is a bad thing. You would think that me coming from south of the border would be like pro-death penalty. I used to be, until I pondered more theologically what that meant. Anyway, freedom of choice. I'm not so sure you can take Surah 256 and then say there's no coercion. There are countries I cannot go to today because the Muslims will throw me in prison. There are people I know who've been in prison. I know people who've been tortured because they were not given freedom of choice. Now you could say, but that's in current events, you're just talking about the Quran. This unanimity that an apostate must be executed, that's fine for the Old Testament and for Islam, but in Christianity there's no such thing. There is choice, and there's no penalty, and there's no coercion.
We have a request from the videographer.
We're on paper now, so it's easier.
Would you like me to read the question?
You can, but if you can.
It's a question for Douglas. Jesus had no problem calling unbelievers dogs, vile, or whitewashed sepulchres, condemned to hell. Is this proper for the Messiah to do?
Right. What was proper for the Messiah may not be what's proper for us. In other words, I don't think we say that we should behave exactly as Jesus did, not that he did anything wrong. We find this principle in the New Testament. The higher up people were, the more knowledge they had, the more responsibility, the more severe he was in his denunciations. For those who were of little influence, or uninformed, or easily led astray, he's very gentle. So that characterizes Jesus only at the upper end of the register, with those who are, let's say, in a position of responsibility. He's very strong. Should we behave that way? Was that the question, or should Jesus have behaved that way? I'm sorry. I think it was appropriate for the Messiah. In fact, the Old Testament scriptures, if you look at Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, it says that when the Messiah comes, it's judgment day. I mean, it could have been the end right there, and that seems like kind of what John the Baptist was expecting. But there was one more stage in history to go before the second coming that I believe in, and that Shabir believes in as a Muslim. Would you add?
Yeah, sure. I have a minute to add something, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So some have pointed to the character of Jesus as depicted in the New Testament, and they have found that there are some flaws to be pointed out. Not that a Muslim would see would point out any flaws, because for Muslims, Jesus is a prophet and messenger of God. We respect him, and we would not say anything negative about him. But if we're studying the New Testament, there are some passages which require some commentary. One is that on one occasion, Jesus said, "I'm not going up to this feast," and then he actually does go up secretly. So he did something contrary to what he said he would do, or he did what he said he wouldn't do. On another occasion, with reference to dogs and so on, there is this woman who came to him and the woman says, "Well, at least the dogs get the scraps that fall off the children's table," and then Jesus ministered to her. So in fact, in a way, confirms her acceptance of this term as dogs for herself. But then the New Testament writers also seem to follow in that footstep. We have in the letters of Paul, for example, people are being called by some very nasty names.
This is a question for Shabir. How do followers of Islam reference or use or twist the teachings of Muhammad to justify acts of terrorism and violence against innocent people?
Yeah, Doug has mentioned some of the passages from the Qur'an that people can actually twist if they take it out of the context. And what we say is put it back in its historical context and the page in which it was written. In terms of the historical context, we see that for several years, the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, was persecuted, he and his followers. Then he left his home city to go and live in peace in another city, which is 400 kilometers to the north. And then while he was in that city, the people from the south came marching against him in armies, one after another, to battle with him. What was he to do? He was now a statesperson, so he had the responsibility to protect his people. He had to march out with his armies to meet the oncoming aggressive army. So he met them at a place called Badr. He met them at a place called Uhud. In a third occasion, he dug a trench, which was a defensive strategy to stave off the attack of the enemy. So in all of these defensive measures, it is clear that others are attacking him in his city, and he's just trying to defend. But when the instructions are given for war, telling him that he is now permitted to defend himself, permitted to fight, the very instructions taken out of this historical context and used in isolation can give some legitimacy to those who are seeking that legitimacy for other reasons. They might be fighting over land or power, and they're using the Quranic verses to their own advantage in this case. They're misusing the verses. The other thing is to put the verses within the context in which they are written. You will see that when there is a verse that deals with violence, it is always cushioned between verses that deal with peace and show a mitigation of that violence. For example, in the 9th chapter of the Quran, in the 6th verse, it says, "If one of the polytheists should seek to be a refugee with you, grant him refuge, so that he may hear the words of God, and then transport him to a place of safety." This is often omitted, and just the verse before it is used as justification for violence.
And I would certainly agree with Shabir, the importance of taking things in context. That famous verse of the sword in 9:5, it does have a context. And later on, we do see that there is a more lenient treatment for Jews and Christians. It's near maybe the middle of the chapter. I think maybe like Surah 29 or something like that. But the chapter also has the strongest words of judgment against those who don't accept Muhammad's claims. So I think you could actually read it either way. And the fact that a passage of violence is between two non-violent passages, how could it be anything other than that? I mean, unless everything is consistently peaceful or consistently hard.
Okay, this question is for Douglas. How do you reconcile the Old Testament emphasis on violence versus the peaceful nature of the New Testament? How do we rationalize this paradox and seeming inconsistency?
My response would be simply that the ancient world was a violent place. it was rough. If you were conquered in battle, you were weak, if you were a woman, things are really bad. In the Old Testament, through the centuries that Yahweh was with Israel, he called them to a just standard. Eye for eye meant not poke out the guy's eye. It meant the punishment can never exceed the crime. And we know that the Jews didn't carry out death penalties except in very rare cases. They were, except for capital, murder one was not allowed to be commuted. All the others were allowed to be settled financially. So, the other part of that, if you left it on the table, it would help me because I kind of get carried away. So God is bringing his people from barbarism to a level of, let's say, justice. When you compare the Old Testament law, say, to the law of Hammurabi, where it's mainly about property crime really gets you annihilated. Adultery, not so bad. He gets them to that level, and then Jesus, who's prophesied in the Old Testament, is going to bring them to the level of peace, the level of the Messiah, because Jesus is the Prince of Peace. So that would be my response. Jesus did not carry a sword, and the only time in the New Testament one of his followers carried a sword and tried to use it, he rebuked him.
So for my 1 minute, this is really a paradox, and the questioner is right. My friend James White has authored a book among his many books entitled The God Who Justifies. And in that book, he says starkly, the God of the New Testament is identical with the God of the Old Testament in every way. Now, when it is right for the God of the Old Testament to command his people to kill, then it is the same God we're dealing with in the New Testament. So you cannot say, as Marcion did, that we have a different God and we only keep a truncated part of the Gospel of Luke and the letters of Paul. No, by Christians accepting the Old Testament, they're accepting, against Marcion, the Old Testament God with all of his violence and all of the immoral commandments that he is shown to have given in the Old Testament. Muslims have done differently. They've gone with the Qur'an, and they have not pasted the Qur'an onto the Old and New Testaments. They've treated the Qur'an as a different book which corrects and in some cases contradicts deliberately the Old and New Testaments.
This question is directed at both Douglas and Shabir. I guess the same question addressed to both of them, so I guess you should each get 2 minutes to respond. Probably 2 minutes to respond. And I'll leave the question here. What does the Bible and Quran say about hell? You both seem to claim that hell is not forever, but the Bible states that hell is everlasting.
Doesn't matter. I think we have similar views. I don't see in the Bible the word eternal is very often used, not to speak of forever and infinity, but it speaks of a limited period of time. Eternal means pertaining to the next age. But I simply don't read either testament as saying that God will sustain us forever if we reject him so that he can torture us. The punishment has to fit the crime. If God is just, then whether it's a second in hell or a million years, there's an end to it. And anything that's a finite period of time is like zero compared to infinity, which entails a rejection of the Catholic, Protestant, and maybe the standard Muslim view as well. If you want a slightly longer answer, my website, if you type in the word terminal at douglasjacoby.com, you can read a short article that gives the scriptures in both testaments supporting that view.
Yeah. As for the Quran, sometimes a distinction is made between the paradise and the hell, and in terms of the promise of God. For example, in the 11th chapter of the Quran, when paradise is described, it says that this is a gift from God that will not be cut off. And the same is not said regarding hell, that this has to endure forever. So Muslim scholars generally are of the view that if God promises something, then morally he has to fulfill that promise. But if he warns or gives a threat, he does not have to carry out the threat. So paradise is a promise. So God has to fulfill his promise morally. No one can force him to do that, but that's what he will do, and nothing else can be expected of him but to fulfill that promise. But when he threatens that he will give a certain punishment, he does not have to carry out that promise or that threat. And that is with hell. In other passages, we see that there is a distinction in that when hell is mentioned, it is mentioned as comprising of a certain number of ages. And eternity does not comprise of a number of ages. Yes, eternity is not divisible into time periods. So hell is said to be ahqaba, which means a number of ages. So scholars infer from that it is a limited duration, though of course it could be very long, and nobody wants to be in there for a moment. So I don't want to minimize the harshness of hell, but at the same time, there are indications that it is not forever. In Surah Al-Bayyinah, the 90th chapter of the Qur'an, that many Muslims have memorized, many who are sitting in this room, you will know that when it speaks about paradise, it says, خَالِدِينَ فِيهَا أَبَدًا. The word abada, which means forever, is used here in the terms of paradise. But when it speaks about hell, it just says khalidina fiha, they will remain therein. But the word forever is not used with reference to hell. So here too you see a contrast in the way the two passages mention paradise and hell. So this was Ibn al-Qayyim's argument, or part of his argument. There is much more.
Are you okay if I add 15 seconds to that? It went kind of short. I'm agreeing with Shabir about the promise versus the threat, and you'll find support for that position in Jeremiah 18 and also in Ezekiel 18. And in the prophet Isaiah, the very last verse, which is what Jesus refers to, shows, and this is the passage that Jesus applies to hell, that these individuals are not conscious, they're not suffering, they're actually unconscious, they're extinct, they're about to stop existing. Look at the last verse of Isaiah, then read the passage on Jesus in Matthew 5 and Luke and Mark 9. Thank you.
So I believe prior to the last question, which was directed at both Douglas and Shabir, the question was for Douglas. This question would be for Shabir. You pointed to the Quran passage, all of you who believe enter into peace, as a defense that the Quran strictly promotes peace. But how is it a promotion of peace when the parameters are only among believers, like-minded people? What does the Quran teach about peace with people who think differently than Muslims?
So, in fact, I would say that verse is not limited to peace with Muslims at all. It's general. It's calling on Muslims to enter completely into peace. But it's not only at peace with fellow Muslims, with all people. As for promoting peace with people of other faiths and those who think differently from Muslims, the Quran tells us in the 5th chapter, the 48th verse, if God wanted, he could have made all people into one religious community. But he has left it so that he may judge each of you with regards to what has reached you. And then the Quran exhorts Muslims, فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ, so race with each other in doing good things. And then in the end, you're going to return to God and he will inform you about the things that you used to differ about. So Doug and I are here. We have different views. We had different views at the start and probably will have different views at the end, slightly modified, but still different. So what do we do in the end? We cannot settle the issue in a 2-hour dialogue and perhaps even in a 4-hour dialogue. Some of the issues will not be settled until we return to God. And he will inform us as to who was right and who was wrong. But God is gracious, and God will excuse us for that which we could not understand in this life. And that is the Quranic message, that we are to be at peace with every one and everything in the world, as all God's creations. And we should not be at loggerheads with each other over the theological differences. Yes, we can discuss these matters, and the Quran calls upon Muslims to enter into dialogue and to start with things that we agree on. So the Quran says, تَعَالَوْا إِلَىٰ كَلِمَةٍ سَوَاءٍ بَيْنَنَا وَبَيْنَكُمْ. Tell the people of the book, Jews and Christians particularly, but more generally, people of Scripture, to come to a word that is common between us and you. And say to the people of the Scripture, your God and our God is one God, and do not argue with them except in a way that is more gracious, and so on.
You referred to Surah 5 ayah 48, right? Okay. Matthew chapter 5, verse 48. That's the end of the passage about loving your enemies, which seems like an impossible thing to do. It's so impossible that Islam and most of Christendom has relied upon just war theory to justify defensive violence. In Matthew 5:48, when Jesus has just
Wherever you go, you will find the Al-Quran in the original language. Many Muslims, millions of Muslims in the world, memorize the entire Al-Quran, 6,236 verses. Even thousands of Muslims, at a very young age, can memorize the entire Al-Quran. This is the evidence that the Al-Quran is the last holy book sent by Allah through the last prophet Muhammad, while the original language of the Bible is in Aramaic. My understanding is that you'll never find the Bible in the original language because the Bible was only for Israel and no longer valid. Also, I never hear the Christian people can memorize the Bible. Please respond.
Well, I wouldn't say that no one memorizes the Bible, but that's way over 30,000 verses. So you're a pentuple hafiz if you can do that. That would be very impressive. Actually, I think the fact that the Bible is in different languages, whereas in the Quran, if you translate it out of Arabic, it's not technically a Quran anymore. I think that's actually a weak point, because the point was to get the message in the hand of everybody, and most Muslims don't speak Arabic. They speak Bahasa or Turkish or Farsi or whatever the language is. That's actually a strength. And I don't mean to be nitpicky, but the Old Testament's written in Hebrew, 1% Aramaic, and eventually, long before the time of Christ, most Jews no longer understood it. It was translated into Greek in the 3rd century BC. And that's the same language that the New Testament is in. So that actually put into the hands of everybody. Right now I'm reading the Greek Old Testament. I've read the New Testament, the Greek New Testament, many times through. It's the same language when I'm reading the Old Testament. And the fact that there are minor errors, copying errors, big deal. The message is what's preserved. The Quran had errors too. A lot of mistakes were made. But we look at the fundamental message. We don't get nitpicky because a word was left out here or there.
The questioner is right. The Quran is memorized right from the very inception. For the earliest times of Muslims, we see that the Quran is memorized. And it is understood by Muslims that the Quran is revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, from the Almighty God in a variety of wording. So it is possible that the Quran might be recited this way or that way, but each wording is memorized by Muslims. There are people who are trained in 10 qira'at, or 10 different ways of reciting the Quran. All of these are considered to be authoritative and authentic as the Word of God. Having the original in its original language means that while we might quarrel about the translation and differ about the interpretation, we have the original reference point. This is entirely lacking when we come to Jesus' sayings, which were delivered in Aramaic, but eventually translated into Greek. We have the Greek, but we don't have the Aramaic. And we want to know often, what did Jesus actually say? And did something get lost in the translation? We don't know because we don't have the original anymore.
Okay, and I think in the interest of time, this will be our last question. And it's actually directed both at Shabir and Douglas. So I'll begin with Shabir. What Islamic teaching do you hold that other Muslim scholars disagree with? And then the same question is directed at Douglas on behalf of Christian teaching and Christian scholars.
I would mention two things here generally, and many more will follow from these two. One is my approach to hadith. As you have heard today, I've taken an approach to hadith which even some Muslims in this room may find surprising, and many will find it welcoming, not knowing that it is possible for a Muslim scholar to actually take that view. It is a view which many Muslims already hold at the common level, but they haven't heard it from too many Muslim scholars. Very basically, that if a hadith is contrary to the Quran, or if a hadith is actually contrary to reason, then we can lay that hadith aside and go with the Quran in such a case. And Muslims have struggled with issues relating to this. For example, it is in the hadith that we find that you should stone the adulterer, but not in the Quran. It is in the hadith that you find that the apostate should be killed, but not in the Quran. Actually, quite the contrary in the Quran, and so on and so forth. Many problematic issues for Muslims today are actually in the hadith, and people do not know to make the distinction between the two. They think all is Islam and all must somehow come from the Quran. But no, if you go painstakingly and you look at everything, trace them to their origins, you will see that many of the problems that we're dealing with today are not from the Quran, but from other sources, partly from hadith. The other issue that people have taken an issue with is my view regarding predestination. I take the view that the future is open. It is a collection of possibilities, and God knows all of the possibilities. If there is something that God wants definitely to happen, He knows that, and it will definitely happen, and no one can change that. And if God prohibits something from happening, then no one can make it possible. But between the impossible and the necessary, there are possible futures. And God knows all of the possible futures, and this is all part of His grand master plan. Nothing will surprise Him, but there are some things that He desires more than others, and He's calling on us to cooperate with Him in those things that we desire. Thank you.
It's interesting how a number of things you say resonate with me. Some of this is very philosophical, and for the hour of the evening, maybe it's too much, but it's very tempting. Yeah, I agree. Shabir is different from other Muslim scholars in a few ways. Obviously, the understanding of hell, his stance towards the hadith, even saying that Jesus was on the cross. The way you explain it sounds a little bit different. I view you as very much a bridge builder and a peacemaker. I don't know if all Muslim scholars are that, but I would say you're different. For me, obviously my view on hell, I've rejected the kind of standard Catholic Orthodox view. I think it makes God into an absolute monster. I don't think it's supported by the scriptures. I don't hold to the view that every biblical manuscript is identical. I think it's actually the strength of the copying that there were many different manuscripts. Smaller errors crept in, didn't invalidate the message. Small changes like that don't change the message. The message is where we're to focus. Probably my view on Trinity is a little bit different too. I'm not saying I don't believe in a Trinity, but it's definitely not the way most of my friends would describe it to me. God the Father is in charge. Jesus is subordinate to God the Father. I believe He's God in nature, but not in rank or order. He's not at that level of the Father. And that makes my fellow Christian professors somewhat uncomfortable. I don't know why exactly. But that's the beauty of it. If every Muslim scholar and every Christian scholar all had the same view, you should be very suspicious. This gives you permission and freedom to study. And I know we would both encourage you, study the sources. Don't just take someone's word for it. Read the Quran, read the Bible, read the Hadith.
Okay, so at this point we will move on to closing arguments, and that would be Shabir going first, and you have 5 minutes to summarize, and then Douglas has 5 minutes as well.
So, coming to the end, after we have said and all that we have said today, I want us to come out of this as friends. We came together to dialogue, to listen to each other, to try to understand more about the two great religions of the world, Islam and Christianity, or two of the great religions of the world, and two of the great scriptures of the world's religions, the Quran and the Bible. And specifically, we wanted to know, how do these scriptures relate to violence? This is not the time to introduce new points, but just simply to summarize what we have said before, so that we draw the strings together of all of the loose points. You recall that our topic was the Quran and the Bible and how these relate to violence. It's not about all of Islam and all of Christianity. I've pointed out that Doug went a little bit off topic when he tried to speak about the first few centuries of Christianity, the first few centuries of Islam. Moreover, I think he went off topic, though he tried to justify this, by bringing the hadith into this. While hadith is relevant to Muslim practice and Muslim understanding, if we had the topic worded differently, we could have included hadith, and that would not have been off topic. If we had said violence, the Quran, the hadith, and the Bible, then of course we speak about all of these. But if Doug insists on going with the hadith, I think that is partly because he does not find sufficient justification in the Quran for saying that the Quran itself is violent, and hence he muddies the water by bringing the hadith into it, from which he will more easily try to prove that there is the presence of violence. But if he stuck strictly to the topic, then as I've argued, the Quran is not a violent book. The Quran is about peace based on the three criteria that I have used. And I've come up with criteria in order to be fair, so we can ask the same questions of the two books. I have criteria number one, does the book call towards peaceful living? I've shown that in the case of the Quran, definitely, Surah 2, verse 208, for example. In the case of the Bible, ambiguous, because whereas the New Testament does call on us to live peacefully, the Old Testament shows God commanding his people to slaughter 7 nations. And this obviously is incompatible, the two, but the book as a whole then becomes ambiguous. The same God who commanded his people to kill others is the God of the New Testament as well. So there's a question, why is he commanding people to live peacefully now? Is it because the people that he's commanding cannot justifiably take up the sword because that will be suicidal because they did not have power? In fact, many analysts, such as Reuben Firestone, have pointed out that this is the case. It's not that now it has suddenly become morally wrong for you to kill people. It is just because it's not practically feasible for you to kill people. So the New Testament, though, on the surface promotes peaceful living, on the whole, with the New Old Testament, it makes for an ambiguous book on this first criterion. As for the second criterion, does the book present its heroes and models as peaceful individuals? We've seen in the case of the Quran that the most violent persons from the Old Testament are not mentioned in the Quran at all. Sometimes the figures who are associated with violence in the Old Testament are mentioned in the Quran, but their violence is either not mentioned at all, and so they are presented as good, moral, upright, peaceful individuals, or their violence are toned down to an acceptable degree. And that brings us to the third point, that whereas there is violence in both books, does the violence fit within what we will call just war theory today? And I've shown that in the case of the Quran, it actually fits the just war criteria. Jus ad bellum, the criteria for going into war, and jus in bello, the criteria for fighting within the war in a just and fair manner. And when we came to the New Testament, on the other hand, and the Old Testament more specifically, we saw that the Bible does not actually fit just war criteria, because no just war criteria is going to justify your marching into territory and taking over the lands of people. Doug said that this land actually belonged to the Israelites, but who said that the land belonged to the Israelites? The Canaanites were already possessors of the land, and possession is 9/10 of the law. But the Israelites came in and said, God told us that the land belongs to us, and we must kill you to take the land over, and this is what we're going to do. This obviously is not justified in any moral system anywhere in the world, and this does not fit with just war theory. So in the end, I rested my case by saying that as far as I can see, the Quran is a book about peace, not about violence, and in the case of the Bible, I left it up to Doug to justify that, and you have seen how well a job he has done of that. Thank you all very much. I hope to speak to you afterwards, in person to person. All the best.
Thank you, Shabir, for your graciousness. I've tried to focus on the two religions, particularly in the pristine, the early part, what we know, what is historically plausible. To answer the question, is violence fundamentally compatible or incompatible with the teaching of the founder? I'm looking at Jesus and Muhammad. I'm not looking at Moses. I'm not looking at Joshua. The Old Testament predicts that it will be replaced by a different testament. That's in Jeremiah 31. And exactly that's what happens. I would actually say the Quran is violent, alarmingly so for anyone who reads it for the first time. The Hadith gets much more violent. I'm not saying every passage is violent, but I'm saying the repetition, the frequency of those passages. You don't believe me? You've not read it. I hope you will read it. The violent streak is evidenced in many ways. Warfare, the attitude towards martyrdom, domestic violence, draconian punishments for crime, the way apostates and blasphemers, retaliation, the whole point of retaliation. Shabir has not made, at least to me, a convincing case that Jesus endorsed violence. Jesus seemed to be turning the Old Testament on its head. I wouldn't say that makes it ambiguous. It's more like there's a new sheriff in town. And he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. It's easy to embrace a simplistic conclusion. We don't want to do that. You've heard it said eye for eye. I say to you, it's not going to be that way anymore. Love your neighbor, hate your enemy? No. But I say to you, the Prince of Peace, practice and preach peace in no uncertain terms. So I would close by making these recommendations to all of us. Number one is to read honestly, really make an effort to read completely the Qur'an and completely the New Testament. I'd say the Old Testament too, but that's a lot longer than the Qur'an. A great example for that historically might be the Persian scholar Al-Tabari, who was willing to read, to deal with things honestly, to preserve accounts even if they're problematic, but to do this with honesty. There may be passages that bother you. That's okay. Anyone with his head on right will be bothered by some passages in Scripture. Second, to resist the temptation to pluck verses out of context. Christians do it, Muslims do it. It's not the right method. I know Shabir agrees with me on that, the importance of tafsir or exegesis. We need people who are trained to handle the text in the right way. Third, the importance of independent thought without fear that I'll be ostracized or my brother's going to burn me to death or I'm going to be kicked out of the community. Ijtihad, the independent thinking. And that's difficult to do, but we need it desperately. And I believe Jesus is an influence for openness and not fear, this culture of fear. And last, a spirit of forgiveness. Because at a personal level, it's very easy for us to want to prove that we're right. The example of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, will rightly guide us. We read in the New Testament, if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, that's commendable before God. To this you were called. Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. That's 1 Peter 2. That is not how most men behave. That's not the way most women behave. That's not how most of me behaves, but that's the way Jesus was, and that was new in the world. It's a challenge to live that way because the true violence can begin in our own hearts. So let's think, let's renounce where we need to, and Shabir, my friend, I know you've gone on the record already taking a stand against Islamist violence. Imagine how more effective you could be if you taught them what the Prince of Peace taught, not presenting an ambiguous or a confused Christ, but to show him that his kingdom was so far above the way of this world, it was indeed a new covenant, New Testament. You already believe he's a prophet and Messiah as a Muslim. I would be very gratified if you came to believe in him as the Prince of Peace and something to focus on, something to study. This is the Jesus that I know. As Imam, you are the one at the front. So you're very well positioned to share this with others, to inform the Ummah of the teachings of Christ on violence. And my friend, just imagine the impact you could have if you did that. Thank all of you this evening for being here. Thank you, Shabir. Thanks to our moderator as well.
Thank you, Shabir. Thank you, Douglas. Please, let's express our appreciation. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, sharing your insight, sharing your knowledge with us here this evening. I would like to reiterate what both Shabir and Douglas have said. There is no substitute for reading the primary documents, reading the New Testament, reading the Quran. Read it in context, read it yourself, read it independently, not under coercion, and come to your own conclusions about what is said in the text. Thank you.